Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
In the Lenten Easter period, I find myself reading around the passages that guide our thinking, and we turn to one of those passages tonight, and we seek that the Lord's blessing will be on us as we open his words. The question is it back to square one? When I look at the different passages that relate to the resurrection, I'm fascinated by the different accounts that exist. That it's true about the Passion narrative, but it's certainly true about the resurrection accounts. And because of the public nature of Easter Day services, I often look at them through the eyes of those who are arriving fresh to the stories of the resurrection. On Easter Day at the Opera House, I looked at this passage in one particular perspective, but tonight it's a set reading across the whole church. And I return to it, I hope, with some new aspects to glean, to open up from what it has to say to us. All four gospel writers present their accounts of the resurrection differently, but with one aspect uniting them all, and that is that they all understate the fact. All of them. None of them go out on a limb to overstate what resurrection is about. They all tell it with modesty. They tell it with restraint. They tell it in a way that would make us take hold of it. Now, the Christian church, on the other hand, may have a very different approach. This could be true of churches of all kinds. I've found some Christians and churches who are far from dramatic, usually, pulling out all the stops at Easter to convince people about the resurrection. I've known groups of Christians who are usually dull, suddenly become electric in the way that they want to talk about faith. Now that's understandable because it's an exciting message, but it's not biblical. Because in the New Testament, there is a calmness about the way in which the accounts of the resurrection are told. One lectionary commentator tells of a story of a church that had its services for Easter Day planned over a number of weeks. They'd given everybody a different role to play within the preparation for it. And, well, what happened was two women burst through the back door of the church. They'd been prearranged to do this. They ran down the center aisle, shouting at the top of their voices that he was risen. Suddenly, at that moment, the choir jumped up and sang the Hallelujah chorus. There were lights flashing at the back. And you really felt you were into something special. Fine, but don't use the New Testament as the basis of that kind of approach. It was Frederick Buechner who actually pointed out the fact that the gospel writers get to a climax and end on a whisper. Now, I don't think because it feels like a whisper, and because it isn't overstated, that doesn't believe that there isn't real conviction about the risen Christ. Not at all. Probably it is because it is a moment of conviction that it's communicated very, very carefully. Mark famously ends his gospel with a kind of lurch of silence. Terrified women flee from the tomb and left with great questions. You remember the other gospels, they have far more. A stranger walks behind casually and inquires, "What's up? What's up? Don't you know?" And then in the garden, we have somebody comes up behind Mary and speaks, shuffles up and says, "Why are you crying?" These are not electric light moments. These are very, very different kinds of experiences. And for that reason, I find John 21 an interesting passage. It is consistent in many ways with the things that I've said about understatement, but it is very much an opening up in a very specific pastoral situation of the reality of the risen Lord. I'd want to make the point that obedience often precedes recognition. And it's obedience to the voice of Jesus Christ in the Galilee encounter that leads the disciples to discover just who he is. This passage draws a close link for me between grace and forgiveness and seeing and believing. They belong together. That's why the passion and the resurrection shouldn't be dramatically separated. The forgiveness and grace we see in the death of Christ is spoken with clarity in their experience of him as they see and as they believe. There's something remarkably compelling about John 21. Interestingly, in some lectionaries around the world, John 21 is read alongside Acts 9, the conversion of the Apostle Paul. And you said, gosh, they're very, very different. Well, not really. There is that coming alive and understanding that the risen Christ makes a difference to the way they live. Clearly would make a difference on these 7 disciples, which this time includes Thomas, you notice. Whatever John 20 was about, by 21, whatever Thomas had been doing not to be there at the first meeting, he wasn't going to make any opportunity of being away from them again. He's with them in the Galilee. And this group of 7 find themselves in a situation where they are changed dramatically. When reaching the conclusion of John 20, as I said on Easter Day, you could be forgiven for thinking it's all over. There's a very sufficient end to John 20, I think, there. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now there's the moment where the lights are flashing. And then John goes on. The gospel opens up again in a very different kind of way. Afterward, Jesus appeared to his disciples. Hoskins, a long time ago, suggested that it was an appropriate conclusion, John 20. A Christian gospel ends properly, not with the appearance of the risen Lord of his disciples and their belief in him, but with a confident statement that the mission to the world undertaken at his command and under his authority would be by the means by which many are saved. However great an ending it is, John 21 is written in our New Testament for us to deal with it, to understand it, to be confronted by it, and I dare say to be changed by it, by what we discover as we read it together. Some people have talked about that it being written by somebody else. I've never been really too interested in discussions of that kind. Whoever's written it, the truth is that it's become very much a part and parcel of our understanding of the New Testament, very much a part and parcel of the Christian truth that has been handed down to us. Now, there are 3 things from this passage that I want to commend to you tonight, here in the theatre and at home. Draw attention to them, and I hope in doing so, ask what have they got to say about our own discipleship as we observe Jesus and those first disciples back in the Galilee in that experience that they have. I offer you 3 thoughts about what's happening for the disciples, and whether this is really going back to square one or going on to a new level. Whichever way it is, let's ask questions about it. First of all, let's go back to fishing. The decision to go fishing, taking the lead from Peter, I think that's important. The disciples were in the Galilee region. Remember, this is where they received their call. This is where the fishermen first heard the call. So to be back fishing is pregnant with meaning. It's far more than just they were going to do a bit of fishing. It's while they were fishing that they received so articulately described that they're from now on, you're going to catch men and women. You know, that's bound to be in their mind in this area. You know what it's like when you go to an area and it brings back memories, thoughts, it evokes experience. I'm sure that the Galilee always did that. And to do it with Jesus would certainly do it. Some people have been highly critical of this fishing expedition. They've said, well, you know, it's a fishing expedition. Should they have been doing it in the first place? Isn't that a sign of apostasy? Isn't the disciples' decision to go fishing, isn't this a way of avoiding the real challenges? Jesus didn't say, I'll meet you on the lake. He said, I'll meet you in the Galilee, meaning the north, the region. He didn't say they had to go fishing. So some people have been critical of that. They've said that it's something that they shouldn't have been doing. They should have been waiting around for Jesus to appear. In fact, Paul Beasley Murray, Baptist scholar, concluded, never has a fishing trip been so severely judged as this one. The experience of the past days must have made an effect upon the disciples. It could be described as tension-filled, from the moment Jesus entered into the city and all those events that constitute the Passion. All of that they've been through. And now their lives have been turned upside down with the news that the women brought, with the news that the Lord appeared to them in that upper room. In all those experiences, they're turned inside out. They really don't know what to do. So they go back to fishing. One writer commented, surely in the hours following Jesus' death, the disciples were crushed and numb. The human spirit can only take so much. Then came the events that brought the emotional overload of another sort altogether. News of the empty tomb, resurrection appearances that had to be seen to be believed. These experiences would not only overwhelm and change the lives of the disciples forever, they would set in motion a whole series of events that would change the story of the world. Could it be, in the aftermath of all the experiences, that they really needed to find space? They needed to find a time to properly and deeply reflect? I think that that's true. Perhaps there is something also in the fact that when Peter made the decision, I'm going fishing, the other lads probably said, that's a good idea, we're off with you. Was it that they created a situation that was full of meaning? Could it be, and many of us do this, when God has spoken to us in some way, in a place, a situation, or an event, some people go back to that place. Folks have places that have a deep and profound spiritual meaning to them. And so they go back to there, not believing they can magic up the presence of God, but say that if God met us here once, he can meet us here again. I'm not sure Peter had all that in his mind, but I'm not sure it would be as far from it as perhaps we might think. It was not difficult for the disciples to respond to his words, I'm going fishing. I think it also tells us, whatever Peter's feeling, whatever judgment the church makes about Peter, he's still the leader. I think that's worth making, that point. When he says, I'm going fishing, they don't say, I know, we're not sure about this. Wait till you've been voted in properly. Then you can make the decisions. Peter's by nature a leader. And he decides that fishing is what he'll do, and those who were gathered around him, that smaller group of disciples, decide that's a sensible thing. And they can't avoid the presence of God. They can't avoid the presence of God, and they won't be able to hide from him on the lake. So the idea that Peter's hiding on the lake is just not true. He's met them before there, so they weren't going to a place where you could say he'd never met them. You remember, if you read Luke 5, you read the story of the storm and the water. There's so much about this lake and the presence of God. At a place of emotional overload, the ordinary and the routine no longer applies. For the word of the psalmist says it all. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? You just can't do that. Does it rain the challenge for all of us of what does going back fishing mean to you? When you're at that place where you're overloaded, at that place where you need to be given the certain presence of the risen Lord, what is it that you do that's your fishing equivalent? I've never been a fisherman, I have done it. I have done it, and I have caught fish. Only because I think I was with people who knew where to go. And after all, that's the secret of fishing, isn't it, really, Knowing where to fish and having the right kit to do it. But what is it that we do? For some, they might... I know some people who throw themselves back into work when they're at that point. So instead of actually going to a place of quiet, they just cover themselves in work. I think it's a reality I've seen many times in moments of grief and bereavement. And I've seen people, and I think folks all have their opinions about all of this. And I feel like I want to say, shut up. Everybody works this out in their own way, and they're all different. For some, it is the difficulty of not doing something. For others, it's the importance of doing the ordinary. For others, it's the wanting to feel like you make a difference and you still count for something, even though you're in the place of despair. Some people retreat to their gardens. Some people who've got gardens would say, well, we never did it, did we? Look at our garden, Some people look at all kinds of things as the place where they can go to find that. And in this short section in John's Gospel, we have a situation where they go back to the place of their original calling. They go back to a place where the ministry of the disciples had originally been initiated by Jesus. And so the disciples go to that place. At Galilee, the link between the call of the disciples and the Lord's resurrection reinforces to me the fact that a leader will always be a follower. Peter may be a leader, but he needs to understand that he's always going to be a follower. I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago about the fact that those of us in ministry and leadership, we are still followers. I'm still, when I come to Easter every year, I still feel I want to, take up my cross and follow him. I still want to be captivated by the stranger of Galilee. I still want to be caught up in such a way that I will be resurrection focused again about life. Secondly, maybe talk about this back to failure. Of all the passages in the Gospels which demonstrate the failure of the disciples, this has to be one of the strongest. It speaks of the failure of the disciples in general, but rather more specifically, it points to the failure of Peter. Because before you ever explore him being reinstated, you have to recognize things had gone wrong for him. I said much of that on Easter Day, but I want to speak in a more specific way. There's something very striking, isn't there, about verse 3 and verse 4. Whenever I read the passage, whether it's on Easter Day or at other times, I read these passages. Remember, John is a gospel that always brings to us comparisons. There are twins, there's light and darkness, good and bad. Well, we read these words. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. Fine. But what we've just read in the verse before was they went out into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Night and day. Success and failure. The acknowledgement of their need to go out into the night to do something, and in the morning somebody meeting them. There's some very interesting truths that are there. The comparison between night and early morning can't be lost on us. It's powerful. Night was without doubt the time to go fishing. I once heard a preacher saying they went out at night fishing. Of course, that's when you go fishing. Especially if you're going to market, as the fishermen in the Galilee did. They sold their fish in the morning. They didn't set up a fish stall at 8 o'clock at night. You set it up in the morning and you fish through the night. And hopefully you don't fish all night. That's the point that's interesting. All night they fished and caught nothing. These highly qualified fishermen, not a bunch of amateurs, not people who are just going out for a trip to do a bit of fishing because that's what the guys do. This is the job that these people had done. Did it kind of rub the fact they've been engaged for 1 or 3 years, between 1 and 3 years, they've been involved in a ministry, they'd stopped their career then, they'd come back. Did they find now they couldn't do it anymore? I don't know, but I think it's powerful that highly qualified fishermen caught nothing. Their emotions must have encapsulated the experience of failure. One writer on John's Gospel proffers the thought that it's another expression or example of the irony of John's Gospel writing. For though Peter thinks he's going back to what he's very capable of, he actually fails in what he's capable of. Now look, I think it's one thing to fail at something you're not good at. It's quite another thing to fail at something that you reckon you can do. Now, if you said to Peter, what can you do? He might have had a few things to say. I don't think he was entirely modest in everything he did. He didn't have the confidence of Paul in some ways, but I think he'd have been prepared to say what he could do. And I reckon fishing was something James and John and Peter knew a bit about. But he didn't do it, and he couldn't do it. Many early writers of John 21 have much to gain from comparing the different roles of John, the beloved disciple, and Peter, because they have two different roles here. John Chrysostom in the homilies of the Gospel of St. John says this: when they recognized him, the disciples, Peter and John, exhibited very different temperaments. The one was fervent, the other more contemplative. The one was ready to go, the other more penetrating. John is the one who first recognized it was Jesus, but Peter was the first to come to him. Peter's eagerness is there again, you know. Whatever he's been through, he hasn't lost it. He hasn't lost that eagerness to get in there and do the thing that is first there. So when somebody says it is the Lord, he's into the water, absolutely committed, once he thought that that was actually Jesus that was cooking up the breakfast on the shore. In his commentary, John Marsh sums up the situation. The night was the best time for fishing, but on their own, without the Lord, nothing could be made of even the best opportunity. There's something about, you can't do this alone, chaps. You really can't. And they had to learn that. They had to go back to the Galilee. Also note the distance. Jerusalem to the Galilee is not a 10-minute walk. It's the other end of the Holy Land. And they had to make their way back to that place from all the tension and pain and challenge of Jerusalem. Failure is an interesting theme to explore. I did it with some of my senior staff just a few days ago. It can be seen as the beginning, in my mind, to fresh understanding. It was Woodrow Wilson who said, "I'd rather fail in a cause that will ultimately succeed than succeed in a cause that will ultimately fail." That's interesting. Turn it round in your minds as a thought. Thomas Edison's the great example, isn't he? When once tried to console an inventor over a failure that the person had in their own particular area, when he had to find out that, "It's too bad," he said, "to do all the work without results." Mr. Edison said, "We've had lots of results. We had 700 things that didn't work before the one that did." Failure is a normative part of life. And I think Peter gives us a little insight into that on that Easter experience. What really matters is that we don't become unhealthily focused on failure. C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters are still worth reading, you know. If you've never read them, go back to them and read them today. I think they're still powerful in what they have to say. He vividly describes Satan's strategy. Lewis wrote this: "He gets Christians to become preoccupied with their failures. From then on, the battle's won and lost for us." The moment we preoccupy ourselves with our failures and don't see that God can bring us through that experience to somewhere better. What we discover about Peter in the Gospels greatly helps us as we observe his sheer humanity. He's one of us. Yet out of his failures, I want to suggest the greatest qualities of his leadership actually grow through this experience of reinstatement. And then thirdly, back to calling. The invitation to breakfast is powerful because it speaks of the fact that they're able to contribute the huge catch. I like this. Breakfast is being cooked. Now, I don't know all the facts, but I get this feeling when I study this passage here that Jesus had something on the go. But he said, "Come on, bring some of your fish." Some of their 153, my gosh, hasn't there been some silly sermons on that? 153, just count it as a lot. Just count it as a lot. Don't try to work it all out. If you add this to this and this to this, and you count how many there were in Rome, and don't get into that. Just count it as a lot. And Jesus takes some of their fish. Out of their failure, they are able to contribute to the place where Jesus meets them. I think that's worth holding on to, something to embrace. Now, this is a meal eaten in silence. Have you ever had a meal eaten in silence? I've had lots of young people that respond immediately to that thought. Something's gone wrong, they've done something wrong, and it's evening meal. Nothing's being said. Now, believe me, something will be said at the right moment, but nothing at this point is being said. Now, that's actually described by John as what it was like. None of them dare say, none of them dare say, none of them dare speak up, none of them dare break into the silence, because something has to happen before that silence can be broken. And what needs to happen is the reinstatement of Peter. Only when that happens can they truly embrace this moment in which they're called back. They're brought back to their calling. They share in a meal. Sharing a meal in which it said at the end of it, this was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And then it concludes, as I felt powerfully it concludes. I thought that was meaningful on Easter Day, those words, follow me. The whole passage moves to this tremendous. This is really back to the beginning. What did Jesus say? Follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Now he's just made them fishers of fish and he says, follow me. The whole thing has just gone full circle. Back to calling. Back to what it is that they're meant to do. Hearing that Jesus invites them to breakfast and observing his manner with them, and Peter, in his fresh sense of call, would assure the disciples that the Last Supper was far from the end. There is the Last Supper and there's the first breakfast. And the first breakfast will give them life and light and purpose for all times. Peter must have had some outstanding moments in his ministry. You know, the calling must have been so powerful for him and the disciples. I can imagine what it was like for him to see Jesus touching the outcast and seeing bodies brought together and healing. And I can imagine what it's like to be with him and listen to him on the mountainside teach the crowds. I can imagine what it must have been like when Jesus took Peter and James and John and took them up a mountainside. And there he was transfigured before them at that great theophany or appearance of God in their presence. I can imagine all those things were important to Peter. But I don't think there's a moment in Peter's life more important than what's happening now. He needed to know the forgiveness of God. He needed to know grace. He needed to know that though he didn't deserve it, God was reaching out to him. I think we can all relate to that by the lakeside experience. For Jesus keeps accepting us, keeps calling us. Grace is about new beginnings. Grace is about new purpose. And I just feel that I want to be with Peter and hear the Lord speak again. Then feed my sheep. Whatever you are, whatever your need is, in this glorious 50 days of the Easter joyful season, hear him speaking again to you, reassuring you, picking you up, and saying to you, get on with it, because I am with you to the end of the age. Amen.